Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We have a couple of announcements as everyone logs in. So first, you'll notice that this session allows you to have your cameras and your mics on. We ask that you follow our presenter's lead for when to go ahead and turn on cameras or turn on microphones. Next, if you'd like to ask a question during this session, please make sure and use the Q&A area to the right of the viewing window. So it looks like we have folks joining us, and it looks like we're going to get started. So Robert and Ed, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And we're both, I'll speak for Robert, we're both delighted to be here. He can chime in as well. So today we're going to spend some time talking about SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, and hopefully add a little color and have some conversation with all of you. So we'll build off of some of the comments earlier from the initial plenary, and we hope to have you engage with us, especially around future directions, because while we may have crystal balls, they're pretty cloudy. And I think hearing from people about what they think SNAP is and can be would be very, very useful for all of us. So our plan, I think, is to run through some slides, get a little context and a little bit of understanding of where SNAP's been in a very tumultuous time, and then maybe offer a few reflections about the future and sort of things to think about, and then really encourage you all to participate by I guess turning off your cameras or not, raising your hand, which I believe is an option on the screen, or asking a question or making a comment in the chat in the Q&A, and we will do our best to monitor all of that, but forgive us if we don't quite get to it all. So I think, Robert, do you want to say hello?
Sure. Thanks, Ed, for that intro already. Hello, everyone. Robert Campbell with Feeding America. The only other thing I thought of by way of background and level setting, one, again, just to lean into what Ed mentioned, we'd love to make this as relevant as possible for you. And I recognize a couple of names on the list, so good to see those of you who I might have had the pleasure of meeting, and so happy to see so many others here. Especially as we're going through slides, there's going to be a lot of nitty gritty SNAP operational things that we'll discuss, and we'd love to hear your experience and in connecting with the program or questions, right, in real time. We know that it's a very dynamic program in normal times, and certainly so much more so as so many things have had to do in COVID to respond and adjust operations, and there's state dynamics and big and small to navigate.
We'll just start with a couple of sort of where SNAP has been and what it's meant, but this is very broad and basic, but I think helps if we're thinking of the future and thinking of a farm bill that's coming up and thinking of what SNAP needs to do to be prepared for people as hopefully they wind back from the pandemic. We thought some sort of context setting was helpful. So, SNAP is our nation's largest food assistance safety net program. And one of the critical features, I think, about SNAP is it's responsive to need and to economic circumstances. And it's responsive at an individual level. In other words, if an individual's circumstances change, they may become eligible for SNAP, or they may no longer become eligible for SNAP, depending usually on income or other factors. But also for a community or even nationwide, it's responsive to general trends in the economy. So this slide hopefully just illustrates that. If you look over time, you see that if you look at the number of, or the share or percentage of people who are low income, and we're using 130% of the poverty line for that red line because that's one of the basic SNAP eligibility tests. And you just match that to how many people participate in SNAP, you see it, it follows quite closely. So when there's more people who are poor, SNAP generally increases because people turn to the program for assistance. When fewer folks are as poor as they are to be eligible for SNAP, there's fewer folks on the program. So the pandemic raised some interesting questions about how responsive that is, and it's certainly, the program has a lot to do to make sure that it's responsive to all communities, including certain communities of color and certain types of communities and folks with circumstances that may make it difficult to access the program, there's a lot of work to do there. But the general trend tends to mirror what's happening in the larger world. Next slide. So who's on SNAP? Folks are poor. People who are participating in SNAP are poor, and what's notable, I think, is the poorer somebody is, the more likely they are to participate in SNAP. And part of that's because the benefits in SNAP are tied to individual circumstances. So very, very poor people get generally more benefits than somebody who's, they're not better off, but they're closer to the eligibility limits, they get less benefits. And so what you see is almost 40% of folks are below or at half the poverty line. That's about $912 a month for a family of 3. That's half the poverty line. That's deep poverty. And a significant number of folks on SNAP are at or below that level, almost no income to meet all of their needs, not just their food needs. And you can see that, in fact, most folks are at 100% of poverty or low. It's still very poor, still very at risk of not only food insecurity, but lots of other insecurities and hardships. So SNAP does a good job of targeting benefits to those in need when it works. Next slide. Who are those very poor people? Well, almost half of them are kids. And close to 2/3 are either children, elderly, or persons with disabilities. So it's our largest child nutrition program in many ways. But I think what it reflects is it targets benefits to people in need and very vulnerable people in need. Again, doesn't get the job completely done, but it does a remarkable job of providing basic food assistance. So that's kind of what we, very briefly, what we think about when we think sort of at a high level about SNAP. Next slide. The pandemic, of course, created a completely new environment, not only for all the millions and millions of individuals who were living close to poverty or in poverty, but also for the agencies and programs that were trying to serve them. So one thing we saw, like I said, SNAP is responsive to circumstances and indeed was quite responsive in different ways to the outbreak of the pandemic back in 15, 16, however many months ago, quite a long time ago. This slide just illustrates change in participation in SNAP since the beginning of the pandemic. And what it tries to highlight is that states really varied in how much their caseloads went up, how much the number of individuals on SNAP went up, or in those gray states actually went down. The participation in SNAP went down during the pandemic. Again, the pandemic hit different places differently at different times. Different communities were differently harmed and impacted by it. But it is pretty remarkable to see, a number of states caseloads went up over 20%. That's like historic and quite unprecedented, except for disasters in sort of SNAP's history, but also went down in a dozen states. So a really wide response. And the reasons for that can be complex, but also useful in understanding sort of what's happening to low-income households in a particular state. Next slide. So we can't go into a ton of detail about sort of what happens in each state, but just to sort of illustrate the trend since the pandemic, the light yellow line here shows sort of the national trend. Pandemic hit in February, March, maybe of 2020, and as I mentioned, SNAP just really exploded in participation. Lots of people lost jobs. Lots of people no longer had places to go to work. Lots of people had to stay home. Lots of people were sick. And for many of them, if they were able to turn to SNAP, it was there to provide temporary assistance. That line kind of goes down over time. So in some places, as economies have recovered, as people return to work, circumstances have changed, there's been a general improvement in people's circumstances and hence a general decline in SNAP, but we're not back to where we started in 2019, early 2020. We're still over 10% above those levels, which I think reflects the continuing need for so many people. But every state's different, as I mentioned on the other side here. So I just picked California being a relatively large state and put that on in comparison, and you can see the circumstances in California were somewhat different. In some states, every state will be different on that sort of a map, but I just wanted to highlight that while SNAP is very responsive, sometimes we get signals that it's not really doing what it needs to be doing in some states. California was hit hard, and it's a little distressing to see caseloads dropping so quickly in December of 2020 when there was still a lockdown and lots of hardship in California. So there's a story there to sort of unpack. And for advocates and community partners, information and data that helps hone in on what really needs to be done in these communities to make sure people have food. Next slide. So, again, I said SNAP's responsive. It's responsive because of the economic circumstances of individuals, but it was actually quite responsive because of Congress and the administration in saying we've got to make sure people have basic access to food, especially at the outset of the pandemic. And as the pandemic endured, Congress and the administration continued to make sure there were some options in SNAP. So kind of what things have been like for the last year or so, Congress approved emergency benefits, emergency allotments, they tend to term them, basically giving people more benefits as a way to compensate for the lost jobs, lost income, and hardship that lots of different measures were reporting, and sort of lots of communities could sort of look out their windows and see, if not experience themselves. So people could get additional benefits, households could get additional benefits, and this is just a snapshot from July of this year, showing that almost every state is continuing those allotments, even a full 15 months after the beginning of the pandemic. Those gray states no longer provide those allotments. So in those states, people are getting the basic sort of regular SNAP benefit that they would get. And a few more states have joined those states since July, but in many states, there's still significant benefits going to individuals because of these emergency allotments, but they'll end when the national public health emergency ends. We don't know when that will be. It will be sometime in 2022, but that will certainly have an impact on lots of households. Next slide. In addition to the benefits going out the door, which is really, I think, the essential thing that SNAP did to help low-income households, states had the ability to waive some of the rules and processes and eligibility determinations that they typically do to process applications and determine whether somebody can receive benefits on SNAP. That was very, very helpful. For lots of reasons, partly due to those states that saw a crush of applications, but also, the circumstances of individuals not being able to have an interview in person or not being able to get documents because they were supposed to be staying at home. So USDA, the federal agency that administers SNAP, was authorized to grant certain waivers on flexibilities. This is, again, one snapshot showing through October of this year, one of the more important flexibility states had, which was extending certification. In other words, allowing people on SNAP for a longer period of time rather than the checks that they do to make sure people stay eligible, and adjusting some of the reporting that they do. So if somebody came in the door, got on SNAP because they needed it, they had some ability to stay on SNAP because of these flexibilities that states could use. Not all states do them. You can see the variation. Again, it just highlights the stories are always different in different places. But this is, I think, a useful thing to keep in mind when we're looking forward in a few minutes, because, despite all the hardship and pain and hunger that the pandemic sort of unleashed in so many communities, it is useful to think of what did we learn, or what good could we get out of this? And one of the things we could be thinking about is, well, were some of these flexibilities useful? We're reducing the burden on households to thread through the application process or keep showing that they're eligible for SNAP. Was that a useful thing that still made sure people who needed assistance were getting it, and those that didn't weren't, but helped them stay on while they needed assistance? Because if it was helpful then, maybe we should be keeping those things going forward in the future. So in your own states, the story will be different about what states did around the pandemic, but it's worth thinking what, if anything, worked. I mean, I think it's also useful to know what didn't work, all the problems, the wait times, the inability to communicate with your agency if you needed to get assistance, lots of problems to work out. But if there were some good things that we learned from the pandemic. I think it's great to be thinking about them and trying to think of how we can extend them and make them permanent.
Yeah.
Almost done with, oh, go ahead.
Can I jump in here? One, because that's a direct segue. I'm just finally remembered to both look at it and see that there are two questions that have been dropped into the Q&A section, both of which are relevant already to what's been shared. But Alejandra, I'd love to start with you. If you are able to come off mute, and I'd welcome you speaking your question aloud for others to hear, and we'd love to dig into it, because I'm sure as you were thinking, it was kind of just where Ed was ending on the challenges and some of the particular functions of the operation and implementation of the program. So I'd love for you to ask that question for the benefit of the whole.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ed, for the presentation. I know my colleagues in policy are constantly working with you, Alejandra with Unidos US. So on the program, SNAP is critical to many of millions of low-income families. One huge challenge we saw in the midst of this pandemic is that some states did not ease, Florida, for example, the signature requirement, and this was just, let me explain a little bit. For people who need in-person assistance are typically helped by community-based organizations such as some of in our network. But because everything was shut down, some organizations started or began providing us assistance in person. Florida was one of the states that did not allow the consent to be released over the phone. So thinking about what is coming next, because I don't think this is going to be the last natural disaster we are going to be confronted with. Hopefully it'll be a very long time. But how can we, and some states did really well, allowing families to quickly enroll or to consent over the phone. Florida wasn't one of them, and I'd be curious to know what you think.
Sure. So I think you're right, and I think the sort of big looming question is partly what you're raising, which is I think some states are looking at the pandemic and saying, well, we closed our offices. Our workers like working from home and not having to go into the office. So we're going to try to choose things that that work for our workers, not necessarily those that work for the individuals who need assistance. So I am very worried about the sort of coming out of the pandemic with much less access to offices and the processes by which you get eligibility. Like technology is great when it works for those for whom it works. So if you have a cell phone with enough of a plan, you can navigate, if your state is doing this, an application process and upload your documents and get your text notifications and do all the kinds of things that make life very easy. That's wonderful. If your state doesn't do a good job of that, that's one problem. But if you don't have a phone or the ability to access the internet in an easy way, that's another problem. And I think the state is obliged to have many routes of access to benefits. And so that is the challenge facing, I think, lots of communities on the ground, is how can the state, and more narrowly targeted, how can your local office or your local point of contact for getting assistance, and not just for SNAP, but you can include any other benefit program, how are they going to keep that access in a world where their pressures might be a little different than the community pressures? They might be thinking, I don't have enough staffing. I've got a huge contract with a technology vendor to provide these services. That's where I've got to worry. No, that's not the only place you have to worry about. You have to worry about how individuals can access your program. And I think it's incumbent to raise the issues because it gets lost in the larger sort of debates about opening up access and getting back to work. Specifically on telephone, I mean, we can talk more in detail or offline about telephone, because I think telephone signatures and flexibilities around the waiver, the in-person requirement, or the various options to go through an interview and sign an application. There are some, I think, possibilities, and in some places, I think they could actually do good things. Other states don't even have the technology to use telephonic signatures to begin with, so the flexibilities didn't even help because they didn't have a system that could take them. So there's more work to do in other states. So it is a sort of state by state thing, and one thing to think about is what should the national level look like? Should it be mandated that every state has to have multiple options to provide signatures, for example? So.
Yeah, thank you. I think I'm specifically, and I have raised the issue to USDA and other stakeholders, especially for community-based organizations lend such a powerful services in local communities. So if they would be allowed to take that consent over the phone or even via text, that would help millions of people, or I don't know if million, but maybe 100,000 people who really cannot complete the application by themselves online. Thank you for your response.
Sure, yeah, and we'll get back to our slides, but just one of the things I find useful when I think of these kinds of policy approaches is to always take the devil's advocate position. So allowing a third party to provide a signature or assistance works when you know that you can trust that third party, right? And that's what the community application assisters do. Probably everybody on this call that works on SNAP is in that category. Could you imagine a neighbor down the hallway who sees an opportunity to get an elderly person to submit an application that they can then take the card and use any way they want or just sell it? Yes, if they could be a third party, right? So it's just a good tool I use in my head, is always think of what the worst case scenario is, because that's where FNS or your state agency they're going to be thinking of those potential problems. So all the good in the world is great, but if there's a loophole or a way of exploiting it, that's the thing that they would want to know can be eliminated, I think. So just think of that even in terms of the telephonic signature, right? How do you know what that voice is or who that person is? So I guess we should get back to the slides. We can return to it if folks want to talk more.
Yeah, and I'll save a general comment, because as Ed and I know, we'll get to this a little bit toward the end of what the future looks like. But only comment here, I think Alejandro, that this is exactly the kind of thinking that Ed and I spend a lot of time on now, right? I mean, there was we would have traded the pandemic in a heartbeat, but there's a whole lot of really important lessons learned, right? And it puts spotlights on challenges, most of which, as I'm sure most on this call know, are not new challenges, right? I mean, the challenge of getting a in-person meeting to check off all those boxes or all those things, there's very few things probably that were totally new. The context with which we're challenged with is, of course, unprecedented, but this is exactly what we're trying to do, is figure out how we can harness the ones that were beneficial and the changes that are improvements. And no doubt that the COVID experience is becoming the foundation for a lot of those conversations currently. So there's one other question, just to name it, because there might be a relatively short answer to start. But in the sake of time, Luke, I'm going to just verbalize this one. Luke mentioned from Iowa that he has seen, Iowa's a state that had some lower participation, and they've even seen numbers lower in the pantry network, presumably in combination with the emergency allotments, right, and increased benefits. So there was a question of if there's any research on the impact of the emergency allotments on food insecurity and or on pantry use. Ed, if you want to take a start, I have a thought on that on the pantry side. Actually, let me since I'm talking just really quickly, I think there's a lot moving really quickly. Luke, even hearing you share this and knowing that was just the tip of the iceberg of what you've experienced. Certainly for those in the Feeding America network of food banks and any partners I have access to that have that kind of experience, continuing to share that story of what you're seeing and connecting those dots as best you can is incredibly helpful. In the research space, a quick plug on this, and Ed might know maybe some better resources. There's definitely research that's been tracking that based on some surveys that the Census Bureau has put out that's been tracking relatively consistently over the course of the pandemic around food hardship and food insecurity type questions. And it has tracked definitely tracked a little bit to some of the bigger government interventions, right? Not just things like emergency allotments, but of course there were stimulus checks that were going out, now child tax credit type payments. So there's definitely been some correlation between some of those influxes and food security. But longer term, we know for sure, because we are actively working with researchers to make sure that they're digging into that as well, right? That some of this takes time with data and such to make sure we're getting at things. But these are exactly the kinds of research questions we're interested in as well.
Yeah, and I think one of the remarkable things from the sort of tracking of hardship is how food insecurity did not it went up, but not nearly as much as you might expect it to. So it will take some time to connect the dots, right? And as Robert said, we're not sure which dot is connecting to where. Like the child tax credit payments seem to have had a huge impact. It looks like emergency allotments would, and I think at some point we'd like to look at places that stopped the emergency allotments and compare them to places that didn't stop them to see if there's different rates of hardship, because that would be a good indication that the emergency allotments did have a big impact, but we haven't done that yet. So there's a lot to learn, and hopefully in a short period of time, so we can get these lessons kind of translated into action. Yes, next slide. So yeah, let's end on at least the slide portion of this on good news that we believe is a permanent and sort of historic improvement to benefits. And I think this was alluded to earlier, which was the increase in benefits that households saw beginning October 1st due to a change in the way the Thrifty Food Plan was calculated, a long overdue sort of modernization of the Thrifty Food Plan. The connection between the Thrifty Food Plan and exactly how that was adjusted and SNAP benefits is mysterious and complex. So we'll set that aside unless people would like to spend the rest of the afternoon chatting about that. But suffice to say, FNS on a relatively quick basis took a look at like, what really does it cost to put a basic nutritious meal on the table for a household, and came up with a number that was much more realistic than what they had been using for 30 or 40 years, which hadn't been truly reflecting the true costs. So now that we have that, it's resulted in a significant boost to benefits that trickles down to just another $1.25 or something a meal, but that's a big difference for individuals and households, and we hope that it's permanent. So my work on food issues, which has been a long time, it's by far the largest impact on people's ability to put food on the table that I've been able to see, and so it's absolutely wonderful, and hopefully something that is the beginning of building even better. So next slide. Oh yeah, I just wanted to flag this. It's a little complicated, but from a household's perspective, there's been a lot of changes in their benefits. They went from what they regularly were getting to, when these emergency allotments came out, this big boost. Then there's another change, of 15% increase to all benefits. So they got even a little bit more. That expired recently, so that went down. Then the Thrifty Food Plan went into effect, so the change was a little bit less. I think the thing to keep in mind is when those emergency allotments end, you're looking at that green drop from 251 to 169 there. Yeah, right there. We don't know when that date will be, but for a household that's dealing with food insecurity, that's struggling to put food on the table and maybe having other financial struggles, that could be a huge impact to their budget, to their ability to plan accordingly. And they may get sort of limited notice about it, right? They might get an announcement, they might get something in their language, they might not, they may not see it, just because it's not required that everybody get an individualized change to that. So I just flag that because in your communities, I think, at least in my experience when I was doing community work, changes in benefits can be very unnerving, even increases, because you don't know if it was something you did or the agency. You don't know how to resolve that issue. So that drop could be very unsettling to folks. And we're trying to think of ways to mitigate it or to make sure the information is clear and gets to people in advance so that they're able to at least process and plan for it. But I wanted to flag that for folks. And with that, let's look to the future, Robert.
Yeah, thanks. So I wanted to pause on Alejandro's question because it was so relevant, of course. And this slide will serve as kind of our bridge to in some ways go back to that conversation. So quick context, and I'm looking at the clock. It looks like we have about 13 minutes. Mary can correct me if that's wrong. So there are a couple of things to note as we look forward, and then I'd love to again pause for either other chats or questions that might have come in. Ed alluded to this very early on. In the federal landscape, the primary piece of legislation that governs the structure of the SNAP program is called the Farm Bill, right? The next Farm Bill legislation should be by calendar up for reauthorization for passage again in 2023. That said, it's a very big bill, of course, more than, of course, just the SNAP program and commodity and other nutrition type programs. It's called the Farm Bill, right? So this is all, agriculture, really, really big issues for the entire country. So that's a big kind of federal anchor we have. But as we talked about, there's, of course, in real time, always more happening in the implementation space. But as we're looking starting with Ed and I's primary lens and looking at federal landscape and how that plays down, we're looking at things like the Thrifty Food Plan or other nitty gritty pieces like telephonic signatures or waivers around different parts of program operations, and saying how can we protect the positive progress we've made. Certainly those that were COVID specific, others that might be separate from the pandemic related experiences. So really looking at what we can do to protect and strengthen what we have. A big point of the second bullet, all the access administrative hurdles, right? And that's the manifestation of what we were talking about earlier. There's so many of those, right? And those are as diverse as there are individuals and the way that they are piecing together their food security for their family as best they can. There are a couple of different groups that we thought worth naming here because there's reasons that for better or worse that they are sometimes treated differently in the context of the SNAP program. So as many of you know, there's a certain population of generally working age adults without children who are limited in their SNAP benefits to only 3 months in normal times if they're not working or documenting work of or sufficient hours of 20 hours a week of qualified activities. That's on a little bit of that's on a pause now due to the pandemic, but that will be coming back when, as a couple other things, as Ed mentioned, there's implications for things that were temporary to come back into place. So that population would be hit differently. Certain non-citizens for either a time period or otherwise are not eligible or have limited eligibility. And then college students, right? Post-secondary, there's just different rules. Again, some for better and worse. For different populations. So we're very in tune with that. Again, all of these have had different changes over the history of the program. Certain have had very acute changes in positive ways during the pandemic that we're looking at how to adjust and maybe keep in a permanent manner. And of course, we wanted to name here, as many of you know, but some maybe rightfully don't, which is very telling as well. Certain U.S. territories, including Puerto Rico, are on an entirely different program altogether, right? So many of them don't have the benefit of having the permanent program that's available elsewhere. They're limited to a block granted program, so a set pot of money, which means that they can't as easily and sometimes at all respond to the natural ebbs and flows, as Ed mentioned, that are the core design and benefits of the SNAP program overall. So I know that both of our organizations and others are really pushing forward, getting chances for that to be resolved in a more equitable way as well. Okay, so I'm going to pause you. We'd love to hear from you, Ed. If you have any other thoughts on looking forward, feel free to start putting ideas in the chat or any other questions you have. There's
a question that we can start off with from Meredith and I'll just read it, but Meredith, feel free to chime in. It's a bit shocking to see how much the benefits will go down post-pandemic. Is there some possibility of getting that green line, that drop in benefits, not to drop? So that's a fantastic question. The short answer would be it would take Congress to authorize some benefits, either a phase out or extending the emergency allotments or doing something. And keep in mind, for states that have already ended their emergency allotments, they've seen an equivalent drop. I mean, they're at a different place in that complicated chart, but they saw those emergency allotments end already. So that was a harsh drop. And I don't know if Congress will do that. It's, it seems like they're having a hard time getting things done right now. But maybe, and it's certainly I think it's worth highlighting what that means, because then there's it creates the will to have to address it. But I'll flag a few things to think about. One is, when people got these emergency allotments, these maximum benefits, they didn't really have to necessarily go through the fine-tooth comb of documenting some of the things they could deduct from their income to maximize their benefits. In other words, if you can show that you have certain childcare costs as a household, you can deduct some of those costs, and that results in an increase in your SNAP benefit. But if you're already getting the maximum, there's no reason to figure out those deductions to see if you can get your regular one up a little bit. So in the last 15 months, nobody has really, including the state agencies, necessarily gone through. We don't know if they've gone through and figured out if people can get deductions from their income, which makes them relatively poorer and thus get more benefits. So one thing to be doing is to saying, hey, state, when you re-engage and touch these folks, in other words, connect with their case by reviewing it or whatever the recertification process is, screen for all the deductions. There's a number of different deductions: medical deductions for some folks, childcare for some, shelter. There's a number of deductions, and by going through those, you can increase the benefits that folks will get. So that would mean their drop would be less. That's a little wonky. Happy to explain more, but that's something we're always trying to think about, is getting those deductions built into the process so people are always getting their sort of benefits that they are eligible for. The other thing I'll flag is that recertification process, having to reprove your eligibility. Actually, a lot of people get cut off of SNAP then. So they go from the, 250 to 0 if they get cut off, right? So I would think this is an opportunity to say, you know what, I'd rather this person lose the EAs but stay on SNAP than actually get cut off of SNAP because the recertification process is screwed up. That paperwork didn't get through because of language barriers. They didn't understand what they needed to do. The verifications weren't processed timely, whatever it is. A lot of states will just cut people off if they haven't gotten through that process in time. So they go to 0. That's a huge drop. And I think this is a chance to say, let's keep them on the program. So there might be some chances to get your state to be focused on that. So there's another question on any appetite, so to speak, or political will to raise federal income eligibility up from 130% of the poverty level. Good question. I don't know the answer as far as the political will goes. And I think for those of you sort of familiar with some of the details in SNAP policy, lots of states have taken an option that allows them to raise modestly that gross income test up to about 200% of poverty, which to me just reflects the need to actually do that the poverty level is too low if many states are actually raising it to help folks that are still very poor when you actually look at the food they have, the money they have available for food. It's going to be a tough thing. I think when you think of like the political debates on SNAP in DC, it's a lot of times the attacks are on it's too expensive. Too much money goes to SNAP, right? So we have to make sure only the truly needy get it, or they only get it for a short period of time, or whatever it is. So given the change in the Thrifty Food Plan and all these emergency allotments, the cost of SNAP is actually higher than it's ever been. So for people who want to attack the program, they're going to have a bigger target to attack. So then adjustments around increasing the income level is hard. It's not to say it's impossible, but it's worth thinking through. Like we didn't succeed when it was a smaller program, so it's hard when it's a larger program. doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, but we should figure out how to do it. And maybe there's little tweaks, right? Can we make that way of raising the income level at the state level something that more states would do? Because that would actually have effect on the ground for individuals if more states did it.
Yeah, I agree with that, right? I think one, for context, we're 2 years, the Farm Bill has a long on-ramp, and there will be a lot of room for discussion, and trust certainly from Feeding America's point of view, and I trust from Ed's as well, right? We're all things are on the table until they're not. The practicality of things, we'll get there at the right moment. But I think the important point is, like Ed said, right, is documenting and being very clear of the reason for the need for that question to even exist, right? And the need is there, and the program not matching up, in things like a poverty level is absolutely worth raising, right? Because it prompts the conversation that I think is always helpful to wherever a farm bill or any conversation may go. Is rooted in what's needed in the community, and making sure to always have space to lift up those stories, whether it's a specific pain point in the operations of interacting with the program. I saw, Megan, you mentioned that in the chat, right? Even deductions are sometimes hard to prove, right? Like, each of these little things are not little when you face them, right? So pulling that thread and figuring out why that is and how to overcome it, but naming it is a huge part of the way we're going to get to a point of fixing, right? And whether that's in a local context of working with the caseworker level of understanding how to prove things, all the way up to how do we change this in a systematic way. These are exactly the kinds of conversations that I think are so valuable for the program overall. So we all hear what these challenges are. There was one other question. I know we're down to about a minute. So if we don't get to it, I'll click to the next slide, as much because it has our emails on there. And feel free to reach out to us. And I think in the profiles of the system, you should be able to find us as well. A comment was on any chance for incentives for purchasing fruits and vegetables in the next farm bill beyond farmers markets, which have, of course, as many probably know, a little bit longer history or sort of some conceptual history. Yes, in a short answer, there is a program now recently renamed in the last farm bill as the GUS program, the Gus Schumacher Nutrition Incentive Program, which in the last few iterations of Farm Bill is intentionally trying to do what you mentioned, right? To push into larger retailers, right? Grocery stores, beyond just farmers markets, to make sure that there's a program and that the technology is there to allow that kind of thing to happen. So it's relatively small. It got a good boost in the last Farm Bill. So a lot of exciting things, and potentially for more later. I've not yet gotten to the next big question, but I know we're close to time, or maybe right at it. So thank you, everyone. Mary, I think I just saw you come back on, so I'm guessing you're doing the little hook here.
Well, I want to make sure everyone writes down these great email addresses, and so you can utilize that for any questions. But feel free, Robert and Ed. First of all, thank you so much for your expertise. I'm sure you can type some answers in the Q&A area to address anything you want to address further. But just thank you so much for your time, for speaking. And up next, everyone, is a short 15-minute break. And then we'll begin the next set of 4 workshop sessions, providing solutions, best practices, and toolkits that you can start to utilize within your respective communities. And to join one of those 4 sessions, you'll just want to click over to workshops in your navigation bar and then enter the session. So that concludes our workshop. And if you'd like to exit this session now, please click on the red phone icon at the bottom of your screen and then click leave. Thanks again, Robert and Ed, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Appreciate you all, the work that you're all doing, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Yeah.